to introduce Professor Ed Kleinberg. I will keep it brief. We provided you with his resume with the program, but just a few things. He is the Robert C. Packwood Trustee Chair in Law at USC's Gould School of Law and a fellow at the Century Foundation. Before he joined Gould School of Law in 2009, Professor Kleinberg served as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Congress's Joint Committee on Taxation. I think a number of us had dealings with him when he was there. Prior to his appointment to the staff of the Joint Committee, Professor Kleinberg, I'm having trouble not calling you Ed. Professor Kleinberg was for over 20 years a partner in the New York office of Cleary, Gottlieb, Steen, and Hamilton. He got his JD from Yale, his MA in History, and BA in Medieval and Renaissance Studies from Brown University. So he is the Renaissance man that I have asked to have you spoken to by today. I think he's going to have any number of very interesting things to say. I think you all know he has a book called We Are Better Than This, How Government Should Spend Our Money, and who better to talk to us at this current time in the situation of debt and tax than Professor Ed Kleinberg.
Thank you, Karen. Good. I'm going to try to work from this so I can work the room more effectively. I want to begin first by thanking you all for being here when you no doubt had more interesting things to do at this hour. Second, I need to apologize for being sick. It is my hope that my voice will hold out for the next hour. I do want to remind all of you that Randolph Paul, one of the great luminaries of the private tax bar and policy in the mid-20th century, died of a heart attack while testifying before Congress in respect of the passage of what became the Internal Revenue Code of 1954. And given how I feel, I think it's quite possible that I will emulate him right down to the letter. Hopefully nearer the end than the beginning of my talk. But if in fact I drop dead, I'd like to ask all of you to consider maybe reaching into your pockets, taking out a few dollars, buying a replica Viking longship, throwing my carcass on it, set it on fire, and set it adrift in San Diego Bay. I think it'd be a very pleasant way to leave this world. I have two presentations. One, a more technical one about the work of the revenue estimating process, which is called the perversion of the tax policy making process. And then this, which is a somewhat larger and more ambitious talk. They're meant to be bookends to each other. They're both available online at papers.ssrn, socialscienceresearchnetwork.com, or my website. And they're both, as you will see in a minute, extremely long-winded as slides go, so that they make sense if you just choose to read them. So with that in mind, let me give you an overview of what I'm hoping to accomplish here. The first point that I want to emphasize is that my view of the world is that fiscal policy is what this committee should be about when it thinks about policy, not tax policy. Government exists to spend our money. Government does not tax us for sport and then set the dollar bills on fire. Right? It is how government spends money that determines our relationship to each other and determines the success of the social fabric in which we live. So when you think about fiscal policy, you need to think about the returns, economic, social, moral returns to government spending, as well as the costs of taxation. The two go hand in glove, and we've had in this country for a great many years a very artificial distinction between the two, in which we argue endlessly about tax policy and never put it into the context of the larger point of fiscal policy. In my view, fiscal policy is directly responsive to some of our most pressing social issues. If you do it right, it addresses inequality, it addresses the stagnant incomes of the middle class, it fosters a long-term, broadly shared economic growth, what I call inclusive growth, and it creates a kind of moral commitment to each other that is sadly lacking today. How does it do that? Well, I'm going to argue that investment and insurance are the key fiscal functions of government. Government investment generates inclusive growth, and it does that, by which I mean that the pie gets larger. We have more, better, higher growth, and so the pie gets larger, and those servings are more broadly shared, so that we have both a faster growth path and a broader sharing of the benefits of that growth than is true today. And that is accretive to our welfare. Welfare, in this sense, means our collective well-being, right? It doesn't mean that you're on welfare. It's asking the question, are we better off, all things considered, taking everything into account? And in my view, government investment is the only instrument through which we can ensure equality of opportunity. It turns out that government insurance is economically efficient. There is a reason why every country in the world, other than the United States, has some form of universal health care. It's not that they just want to spite us, it's that they realize that that is the economically efficient way to deliver health care. But to me, more interestingly, and the more I think about this, the more I like to focus on the idea that government insurance responds to a fundamental moral dilemma that many people in this room will find highly distressing, which is that luck has more to do with your life and the outcomes of your life than you would like to admit. I worked for Wall Street for 30 years. One person came to me in 30 years and said that he was an extraordinarily lucky man. The others all felt that their tens or hundreds of millions were simply their karmic reward for being a superior version of the human species. The other side of this is the systematic denial of luck, that whatever I have is because I earned it. Everything is my just desserts. And that is a pernicious and corrosive way to relate to each other. If you adopt a view of the world in which you acknowledge the role of luck, you become a little bit more humble, and when you become more humble, you're prepared to feel a little bit more empathy with your fellow citizens, and that leads to what I call the economics of empathy. Finally, by way of introduction, I'm going to argue that government is not a zero-sum game. It follows from what I just said. Government investment creates value. Government investment creates value, creates growth. And government insurance, in fact, complements the private sector as well. This is not a question of going back to a socialist environment. It's recognizing that private markets have severe constraints on many issues. The accidents of to whom we were born, when we were born, which turns out to matter a lot. If you compare law students who graduated law school in 2005 and law students who graduated in 2010, and ask yourself, how are their careers going? You're going to get very different answers, simply by virtue of being in a slightly different age cohort, who, when, and where they were born. The inclusive growth story completely belies the framing of our discussions as makers versus takers and the like. And it turns out, and this is the subject of the other more technical presentation, it turns out that all of the metrics we use to look at tax policy don't capture any of this. They're all much more misleading in the results that they produce in the particular environment in which we find ourselves, where we are drowning in deficits. The results reached by standard analytical tools looking at proposed legislation, TCJA, for example, produces highly misleading outcomes. And finally, a point that is rarely appreciated is that government spending is very progressive. And what that means is that you can have a progressive fiscal system in its entirety without steeply progressive tax rates. All you got to do is collect a lot of taxes. And that is how Northern Europe conducts itself. Our tax system is more progressive than that of the Northern European countries. And yet, as you'll see, we do much less by way of, and I hate this term, it's a pernicious term, of redistribution. So, I think the key takeaway from what is our fiscal policy today is the fact that we are drowning in deficits, and that colors everything. You know, you don't have to be an old-fashioned deficit hawk to realize that, especially having been exacerbated by the TCJA, having been exacerbated by the budget deal reached Thursday night, and exacerbated by the fact that we all know that the favorable to your clients' temporary provisions in TCJA will in fact be extended, all things considered, that we are looking not at 5% deficits when I wrote these slides, but deficits more in the range of 6 to 7% of GDP. And if you think about it for a minute, if we were able to have sustained economic growth of 3% of GDP, that would be fantastic. And if deficits are growing at 6% of GDP, while growth is growing at 3% of GDP, deficits swallow the world. And that's a famous economist once said, if something can't continue forever, it won't. And that was considered a terribly witty remark. In fact, it's a snarky kind of observation, because the question is, what happens when it doesn't continue? Who is going to bear the burden of those deficits? And embedded in how the TCJA, for example, was scored, or were some very lower income citizen analyses that just follow from the application of our standard metrics, our standard tools, to a tax bill that by itself promised a $1.5 trillion increase in the deficit. How those deficits are shared, that is, how those burdens are shared, whether through spending cuts, through higher taxes, those have profound implications on welfare. And it would be, I think, a wonderful thing if organizations like this one thought more and took on more of a role to think about the fiscal policy implications, not just the tax, the technical tax comments that I used to help with, that are all very important, but in the end, as my friend Dana Trier said to me when I was going on and on about one of these kinds of technical issues, like we heard about this morning, he said, Kleinbard, you do not understand that as far as Washington is concerned, your problems are like a fly on the back of an elephant. And we need to think about the elephant. So deficits have no information content by themselves, by which I mean they're very, very large. They are not sustainable. But that doesn't tell us what to do. Are the deficits very large because we spend too much? Are the deficits very large because we don't tax enough? Or are we just off the mark on both of them? So you have to go a little bit deeper to have some kind of intuition on that. And the point that I've made before, but I have to begin with again, is that the United States of America, when you benchmark it against peer countries, and I do not accept the view that the United States is so exceptional that every Frenchman alive goes to bed at night with his baguette in one hand, his chèvre in the other, crying himself to sleep that he does not live in the United States of America. There are peer countries. They have reasonably happy lives. Indeed, when you do international happiness metrics, the United States does not come out as well as you might expect. When you look at the United States and benchmark it against other countries, we are the lowest taxed major economy in the world, including federal, state, and local. We exceed all other countries only in one thing, which is our tax whining. But in terms of the taxes we pay, we are at the very bottom of the heap. And our revenues are going down and down and down. The TCJA is going to bring us to levels not seen in my lifetime, except at the bottom of the Great Recession. And it turns out those taxes are broadly shared. This is not a case where in our system it is mildly progressive, but when you look at all taxes, it turns out that our tax burdens are broadly shared. The United States is an outlier on the spending side. Again, when you benchmark us to other countries, only in two places. One is military spending. We spend right now about 36% of world spending on the military. A few years ago when I looked at this, it was more like 45%. China's ramped up, but we're still spending 36% of the world's spending on military, and we have 5% of the world's population. Nothing wrong with that if that's what we want, but my advice would be if that's what we want, we really ought to pay for it, and we're not doing that right now. The other place where we're a great outlier, the greatest fiscal policy crisis actually in the United States is healthcare. And the United States spends over 17% of GDP each year on healthcare. That's public plus private. Any of you who's gone through any kind of health crisis and had to, for whatever reason, reach into your own pocket to pay a significant amount of expenses will agree with me that that's a kind of private taxation because I may not care about you, but to you, you're really quite important. And so you will spend the money to keep yourself alive. That is the kind of existential imperative that motivates us all. So we spend over 17%, private and public put together. Switzerland today is number 2, about 12% of GDP. If we spent what Switzerland spent as a percentage of GDP, we would have $11 trillion in our pockets over the course of a decade. That's a number. And what I would like to suggest, don't have time to do, is that our healthcare industry today is the greatest example of what in the academic setting we would call rent seeking. That is, people getting paid extraordinary amounts of money without delivering the value that justifies it. So that's where, if you want to actually make things better, come up with a cheap pill that cures diabetes. That would be a fiscal breakthrough. This just demonstrates the point I just made, that our tax distributions aren't very lopsided. Yes, the top 1% pays 24% of the total tax burden of Americans against 22% of all the income of pre-tax market incomes of Americans. So don't feel too bad for them. They have 22% of the market income. That's not an extraordinarily onerous burden relative to their very fortunate position. Maybe I should say in this group, our very fortunate position. And so where does our money go when we do spend it? Well, and looking around the room, I see many, many examples of this. It goes to, it goes to old farts like me. And we're just not shuffling off this mortal coil fast enough. And so what we see in the United States today are really very profound problems in which the baby boom of the 1940s has now given rise to the geezer boom of the first few decades of the 21st century. And the remedy for that would have been sustained, deliberate, higher immigration quotas for years. And that, of course, is exactly the opposite of where we are. Again, comparing us to our peer countries, we're numbered like 23 out of the 34 OECD countries in our total social spending, including Social Security and Medicare. And on income security programs, food stamps, which is not the correct term, on and on and on, unemployment insurance, we spend about 1.5% of GDP. Our net investment in public infrastructure, that is net of depreciation, is about 0. So we're not making any progress. We're just barely treading water. And our non-defense discretionary spending is still heading to the lowest levels in recent history. So what does this all have to do? That's where we are today. I argued that fiscal policy is rather important when it comes to inequality. And your first reaction would be, oh, I get it. We're going to have steeply progressive tax rates on the affluent, and you'll kill the goose that lays the golden egg, and then you'll be sorry. No, I think the point is a much more profound one than that. We are genuinely spiting ourselves by not considering the inclusive growth that follows from well-designed public investment. So I think this is the most important chart in my little talk. It explains everything you want to know about the last several years in politics. The nicely curved upward blue line is growth of GDP. since 1985, very impressive. Took a little dip, during the Great Recession. But if you look at where our real, that is inflation-adjusted, median, meaning the guys in the middle, not average, but the guy in the middle, household incomes, it's gone up a tiny bit. And the real median cash wages of men has not gone up since 1985. And what we're going to see is the reason why household incomes have gone up at all is because the entry into the workforce of the second-to-earn spouse, which in most of America, most of the time means the wife going into the workforce. So where did the money go? Well, it turns out that someone captured all that growth, and you'll perhaps not be surprised, seeing that median incomes haven't really moved very much, that it's at the very top end. It's not the top 10%. So way on the left, there's a missing column, which is not a fault of the graphic artist. That's the bottom half of the country. Bottom half of the country has captured no growth to speak of from 1980 to 2014. The middle 40% captured about 20% of growth, and so on. When you get to the top 1%, which is the fourth column, you're talking about their incomes went up about 200% in that 34-year period, but the top one-tenth of 1%, which is the top 1/10,000th, saw their incomes going up 450%, and the top 100,000th saw their income going up over 600%. So the share, who captured growth, is very, very top-weighted. And there are different ways of measuring this. They come up with slightly different numbers, but the basic theme, I think, remains unassailable. And what's more, this has profound impacts. The top 1% now control 42% of our national wealth. That's a great deal. The top 1/10,000th of Americans control 11% of our wealth. And yet, at the same time, we have the highest adult poverty rate in the OECD, and we have among the very highest ratios of rich to poor in the OECD. So we are unique. We are the only high-income, high-inequality country in the world. Let me try and make this more vivid. This is all the countries in the OECD. I put a red box around the United States, and this is what's called the P90 to P10 ratio. So this looks at people at the 90th percentile by income versus people in the 10th percentile by income. And you'll see two interesting facts here. The first, the blue column itself, says, how big is that ratio? And the answer of the United States is it's really high. The only countries where it's as high or higher are Turkey, Israel, Chile, and Mexico. And then if you look at the little diamond, that represents another measure of inequality called the Gini index, which is not perfect, but it's a very commonly used number. And you can see how much higher the US Gini index is after tax, after transfer payments, than is any country that we would think of as a peer country. I don't accept that our standards should be set by what Turkey, Chile, and Mexico consider to be normal. What are the costs of inequality? Well, I would hope a lot of it should be obvious, but I want to emphasize the point that the inadequate investment in human capital is the key thought here. If you believe in equality of opportunity, then you must necessarily also believe that comparably able kids have the same investment behind them, regardless of their parents' income levels. That's what the kids deserve. And that, of course, is what we do not do in this country. We don't invest the same. And that, in turn, is the secret to inclusive growth, because it turns out that the largest asset class in the United States, if you think about a balance sheet of the United States, what is our largest asset class? Well, the largest asset class of the United States is us, ourselves. Labor accounts for 2/3 of GDP. And so if you systematically underinvest through bad public education, if you systematically underinvest in the largest asset class in the United States, you are going to end up with a more unequal society, because some people, in effect, can make that up through private education, and the numbers are staggering, the difference in investment. And you are not going to enable people to grow, to pursue their full potential, and in doing so, you are depriving all of us of their productivity. We have the theme of rent-seeking behavior, again, the theme that many, particularly in the corporate sector, have been extremely successful at gaming the system, aided and abetted by the compensation consulting firms in entering into a happy spiral of ever higher incomes, divorced from genuine market discipline. And we have the obvious concentration of political and market power. But again, the more I think about this, the more I want to emphasize that moral theme, which is that by conflating market success with some inner merit, we are in effect putting ourselves on a path where we are enfranchising inequality by not making the necessary investments in each other. In light of time, I'm not going to bore you with all the different data sources, and in fact, I'm going to quite quickly, just this little chart, which the red line goes from 1982, makes the point I made before, that working age men have the same salaries today that they did in 1982. Working age adults have gone up a bit, and the reason is the entry of women into the workforce. Now that's a great thing at one level, obviously a great thing. Many women are now able to pursue careers that were not possible before, but it's not necessarily true in every case. There are people who are the second to enter spouse is there in order to keep a roof over the family's heads, not because of any personal desire to fulfill his or her own objectives. The top 1% income share has soared. You can see where 1928 was. You can see where we are today. The red line is pre-tax. The blue line is after-tax and transfer payments. So it's the net of the explicit fiscal system of the United States. Doesn't matter which you look at. At the same time, the bottom half has fallen, and transfers make a difference. The blue line is more modulated than is the red. The red falls more steeply, but they both decline, and they both declined a great deal since, forgive me, I don't remember, since the mid-1970s. Our wealth distribution is extraordinarily top-heavy. The red line here is the most interesting because the red line represents, again, the top 1/10,000ths of Americans. And you can see that from the mid-1970s to today, they've essentially quintupled their share of American wealth. I mean, the great philosopher once said, it's good to be the king. So our fiscal system modulates results, but not very much. So again, I put a red box around the United States and compared it to countries that might remotely be thought of as peer countries: Canada, Sweden, Australia, Japan, Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and Spain. And what you see in these comparisons is the darker blue line represents the inequality of distributions of market incomes. We're not that different in that respect from other countries, we're really fairly close to many of them. But when you look at the light blue, so aqua-colored, you see that we are much more unequal after you take into account the effect of taxes and transfer payments. And here's the point. Look at Germany. It's a market economy. They put their pants on one leg at a time. They're not that different from us. And their market inequality, their market income inequalities is not that different from that of the United States. But look at the dramatic difference in what's called disposable income, that is after taxes, after transfer. How much money do I have in my pocket to live? Look at the dramatic difference in the inequality index. The higher the number, the more unequal. The United States is closing in on 0.4, and Germany is at 0.3. That is a dramatic difference. And why is that? It's because we don't tax as much. They tax more, which enables them to spend more, and so public education is high quality and free. The universities are public and free, Healthcare is complicated in Germany, but essentially the same. So they ask more of government, they get more from government, and in doing so, they end up with a healthier, more equal society. So what do we do about this? Well, I think it follows from what I've said that we have a very inadequate tax base for our spending path. I'm not claiming that we are the drunken sailor of government spending today. That's a false narrative. We spend more on healthcare and the military. Healthcare is clearly out of whack. The military may be a good idea. I have no views on how many aircraft carriers this country needs. I just know they're very, very expensive. We have the social costs that come from that. So what does tax policy have to say about it? Here, I think, is where people have framed the debate in ways that are profoundly unhelpful to everybody. And this is the fault of the progressive movement, who says, what we need is steeply higher progressive tax rates, and that is how we're going to soak the rich and help the poor. That's false. It doesn't really matter to me how we collect the revenue. All I want is that we collect more revenue. And the irony is, whether you call it a sales tax or a value-added tax, is it regressive? Yeah, but the spending that it enables is highly progressive, and the net of the two is actually a good deal for the country. That's exactly the Northern European strategy. So if we want to talk about progressivity of the tax system, 3 observations. The first, the 37% tax rate that many in this room now enjoy on their top dollars of income applies, first, it's too low a number relative to world norms. We should spend more time benchmarking. Second, it applies starting at $600,000. That's the top bracket cuts in. That's way out of whack with other countries. Germany, the top bracket cuts in at under 6 figures. So our system can absorb somewhat more progressivity in the income tax arena, but nobody in their right mind should be arguing for 70% tax rates. We need to rethink how we tax capital income. Fortunately, I've done that for you. I was going to say, all that's required is you read my two long, tedious articles on the topic. At this point, I'll settle for you downloading them. And don't even bother reading them. Just give me the click. I'll settle for that. One's called Capital Taxation in an Age of Inequality, and the brand new paper, The Right Tax at the Right Time, which lays out in great specificity at a level that an ABA tax section lawyer would appreciate how exactly one would go about doing things. So again, you can't lose sight of how important the spending side is in figuring out what are the consequences of fiscal policy. It's the spending side that dominates. But we do need more revenues. There's no, so how do we do that? Well, a carbon tax would raise $1 trillion over 10 years. The DBCFT that Paul Ryan began with would have raised $1.2 trillion over 10 years, the border adjustment tax. It was dismissed because the proponents oversold it, and then the opponents overreacted to it. But there was actually, there was some real merit going on in that idea, and it was disappointing to see it die so ignominiously. National VAT, a sales tax, is how every other country has, in effect, recognized the strategy of raising revenues regardless of the progressivity of the tax system in order to fund public education, fund public infrastructure, fund research and development, and fund public insurance in ways that lead to a higher growth path. The TCJA has made a number of substantive errors, which I'm only too glad to tell you about. In particular, the pass-through giveaway is inexcusable. If you look at the tax rate on top individual incomes, the top rate on pass-through incomes other than the immediately distributed, they're all about 37%, ignoring the 3.8% HI tax and so on. They're all right about 37%. And the only one outlier is the new pass-through giveaway, which has no policy justification to it whatsoever. And if anybody wants to debate that, I will be only too thrilled to continue that conversation. The corporate tax rate at 21%, we have to be competitive. Well, first of all, we really don't. It's good to be the king. And when it comes to trade, when it comes to the role of the international economy, the United States is really not the same as Luxembourg. We have a market power that we can take advantage of. But to have a 21% tax rate and expensing and interest deductibility, even capped, is far too generous. Every economist will tell you, you want expensing, that's great. You want that plus a reasonable corporate tax rate, that's great. But once you have expensing, it is absolutely illogical to permit any interest deduction. And again, we can go through that in detail. Finally, the estate tax. I mean, just think about this for a minute. My spouse, let's assume, as she's certainly betting that I predecease her, my spouse dies with a $20 million estate. Okay? Not only does that pass tax-free to her heirs, but they get a tax-free step-up. You get both things. That's madness. It means you're exempt from the income tax if you can avoid the realization trap and the estate tax, and that is a windfall to capital, which, given how top-heavy it is in the distribution, really can't be justified. So, wait, I got more. I'm fading here, but I got more. So, look, I'm not going to, in light of the time, I'm not going to go through, sort of the essence of my, what's the ridiculous new way we're supposed to say, the FODI? I think of it as the goofy, personally, but, this is a dual bite, like a tax bite. The dual bite is really a well-developed, carefully specified new approach, generally new approach to capital income taxation. It's laid out in the papers, and in light of time, all I'm going to do is, urge you to take a peek if it's a topic that interests you, because I want to talk about some other things in a little bit more detail. Needless to say, I think it's wonderful. The slides I skipped demonstrate why I believe it to be wonderful. But what would you expect me to say? Right? So, I mean, I've worked for, 5 or 6 years on it. So, I want to talk about growth. And I want to talk about this idea that tax cuts lead to greater growth, and why the hell haven't I emphasized that? Why is that missing from my narrative? Well, the answer is that the growth story is much more pernicious than is commonly understood. The idea is very simple. Greater after-tax returns to labor, because the tax rates have gone down, or after-tax returns to capital, because the tax rates have gone down, will induce more of each. We'll work more, we'll invest more. But those models, those growth models, don't purport to say anything about the distribution of the benefits or burdens that come with those tax cuts. And that's going to be the big point. When you cut taxes, you are also making a commitment to either cut spending or raise taxes. Right? To spend, Milton Friedman said, to spend is to tax. When government spends, it's making a commitment to tax to raise the money at some point, maybe today, maybe in the future, to pay for that spending. Well, the same is also true. When you cut taxes, you are making a commitment to either cut spending or raise some other taxes. And when you do that, you have to ask the question, well, who exactly is going to bear that burden? And that is completely missing from the analytical tools used today in analyzing tax policy. The models themselves are kind of interesting if you're a nerd. But the point I want to emphasize is how deficits change everything. It means that when you run the most sensitive of these models, the models that show big growth effects from tax cuts, the model doesn't work. The model literally says these inputs cannot be modeled. Because what it assumes is that people have infinite foresight. They can see infinitely into the future. They essentially live forever. And they say, with these deficits, I'm not going to buy treasury bonds 40 years from now. And if I'm not going to buy them 40 years from now, I don't want to hold them 30 years from now. If I don't want to hold them 30 years from now, sure as hell I'm not going to hold them 20 years from now. And so the whole system explodes. So you cannot, in fact, run the model with the fiscal path that the United States is on. So what do we do about that? And I know it sounds like I'm making this crap up, but I'm actually not. What the JCT says, and this is not the JCT's fault, this is the nature of the model. It says, the JCT says, usually somewhere on page 12, it is necessary to create counterfactual stable ratios of debt to GDP within the baseline and policy simulations in order to get the growth model to compute, in order to declare that we're going to have lots of growth. But if you're actually going to have that growth, well, then you have to actually implement those counterfactual policies. This is the way economists talk when they want to say, and now we're going to make some shit up. And again, it's not the fault of the estimator, it's the nature of the model. And so what is the counterfactual policy that the JCT assumed in the TCJA? They assumed that after year 30, transfer payments would be slashed, Social Security would disappear, and so on. They don't spell out exactly how much would be, but a huge fraction of Social Security, Medicare would just disappear. And why in year 30? Because by then every member of Congress would be dead, and they couldn't be held accountable. And so that is literally how you produce growth effects. And so the JCT, again, if you read enough of these pamphlets, slowly enough, you discover that in the models, again, this is the nature of the model, not the nature of the estimator, people work and save more over the first 10 years in anticipation of a future loss of valued spending in the distant future, because they recognize the need to accumulate more assets on their own, which is to say that once you've told people that you're going to be screwed when you retire, people say, rats, I better start working harder now. And then you declare, look, GDP went up. Everybody's doing double shifts. Isn't that fantastic? That is a very, very incomplete picture of the welfare of Americans to say, let's promise everybody that they won't get a penny from Social Security, so they work more now so that we can declare that GDP will have gone up in the next 10 years. And of course, we know we're not going to really do it, but let's take credit for it anyway through the revenue estimating process. This is the fundamental problem that deficits introduce, that our promises of growth are simply based on false assumptions when compared to reality, or to the extent you think these assumptions are right, we're not in fact debating them. So these models don't say anything about our welfare, our well-being. The standard metrics that we're using give poor policy advice. It's not just the dynamic growth charade to which there are lots of other individual items. Take the scoring of the repeal of the individual mandate. That would cost money, you would think, as a tax matter, because some people who are paying the tax rather than buying insurance, health insurance today, will not pay the tax in the future. So that costs money, but it was scored as raising a lot of revenue. Raising a lot of revenue. How did it score a lot of revenue? Well, there'd be fewer people would buy insurance on exchanges, therefore the federally subsidized premium tax credits would go down. Premium tax credits are spending, but they're found in the Internal Revenue Code, so that's treated as part of the tax system for purposes of scoring a tax bill, a so-called outlay effect. So we take revenue credit for the fact that we won't be subsidizing as much insurance. But then another $180 billion came from the fact that there would be less money spent on Medicaid because it got more efficient all of a sudden? No, because people would be so confused and there'd be so much less outreach to poorer Americans that people wouldn't sign up for the Medicaid for which they qualified. And that second or third order effect was also scored as a revenue component of the TCJA. And I asked the ABA, where were you? Why didn't somebody raise their hand and say, why is the fact that poorer Americans will be too confused to understand that they're still eligible for Medicaid? Why is that included as a tax pickup in a tax bill which had a hard cap of $1.5 trillion? $180 billion went a long way to hitting that, to staying under that cap. And then when the official distributional analysis was done, the fact that the poor would not get all that Medicaid spending because they'd be too confused and wouldn't apply, that was left out of the distributional analysis by the tax estimators. I think that that is the kind of issue which this organization should be thinking a bit more about. So here you get a sense. This shows the implications of the TCJA in the year 2025 as applied to different income categories. Not the same number of Americans. Obviously, Americans in the $1 million and above category is a smaller number than Americans in the $40,000 to $50,000 category. This is a case where a positive number is a bad thing. This means you're going to pay more taxes or have less money spent on you. The left is the official tax distributional analysis. And what it shows is, for example, that families in the $20,000 to $30,000 income category will suffer a detriment of about $3,000 in the year 2025. But the CBO was bullied by some senators into doing a more complete analysis, and when the CBO included the implications of lower Medicaid spending, lower premium tax credits, and so on, they found that the burden was going to be 4 times that much. It was going to be $11 billion. And none of that even includes the larger question I've been trying to emphasize of the financing of the deficit. So on whom will that fall? And to try to wrap things up as quickly as I can, I've secured the doors so you can't escape, is that the investment that we are missing is pro-growth, and it's a pro-growth in a broadly shared way because it is the investment in our largest asset class, again, which is ourselves. And government alone can be the investor here. There is no private market in smart kids, thank God. And so either government does a good job, or in fact, we make inequality into an hereditable gene by virtue of enabling mediocre rich kids to start their adult lives with infinitely more capital invested behind them and infinitely more networking, and as a result, a much easier path in the material life. The same is true for good health. If you think about what you want from machines, you maintain them so that they keep cranking out at a high level. We should really do the same with ourselves, right? We really ought to think about healthcare as a way that we invest in the human machine that is the driver of our economy. As a result of all of this, our mobility, our great story of the mobility of the Americans, our outcomes are actually worse than that of Canada, worse than most of Northern Europe. We have a much more ossified social structure than do these other countries. Just to finish up, as I said before, I think luck has everything to do with it. I really do. And I think that one of the mistakes I made in my earlier book, besides it being too long for anybody to read, is that I didn't start with this as a point. I tried to make the economic case for government investment and so on. That's the wrong place to start, I've decided. I think the place to start is, in fact, the moral argument that our fortunes in life are highly contingent, and we control much less of our lives than we like to admit. And this is very uncomfortable for a lot of people because they say, I worked very hard and I'm rich. Well, yes, those two things are true. I acknowledge that. But there are other people who work very hard and are nonetheless poor. And then you say, well, it's because I'm smart. I said, really? Did you check that box right before you were born? Because if I were offered that, that form, you know what I would have said? I'd like to be 10% less smart and 10% better looking. But I was not offered that chance. And so I call this market triumphalism, the denial of luck. This is the so-called conservative movement in America today is predicated on arguing that there is no such thing as fortune in our lives, and therefore, how could there possibly be a role for government? And the result is that this market triumphalism leads to a very impoverished idea of our obligations to each other. Government insurance is the response here. Government insurance is not the same as transfers. And even when we talk about transfers, what we're missing, and we miss this in all of the economics literature just about, is so-called transfer payments can be more properly characterized in many cases as investment. Investment in the young, which in fact yields something. So to call it a transfer payment implies that the money is sort of consumed, in casinos or some other, pernicious myth, as a result of which there's no value to those transfer payments. That is false, it is pernicious, and misses the picture of the inclusive growth. And insurance in particular is, as I say, it's not, if you think about insurance, take a big step back. Insurance is literally a zero-sum game. Literally, we all chip in a little, and from that pot, we pay the person who suffered an adverse fortuity, right? So in that sense, it technically is a zero-sum game, and yet we all buy insurance. Why do we do that if it's a zero-sum game? It's because our welfare is increased knowing that we're paying a small cost today and in turn not suffering a gigantic loss in the future, a small potential of a gigantic loss in the future. That increases our welfare even if technically it's like a co-op. The money, there is no new money in the system. So when we, in fact, think about brute luck a little bit more honestly, we become, I think, a little bit more humble. That leads to greater empathy towards our fellow citizen. We actualize that through insurance, at the public insurance, and by doing that, we institutionalize an empathetic economy. We have 330 million Americans in this country. I know hardly any of them. If I did know more, I wouldn't like them, but that's not the point. You know, the point is, if you're going to decide you're going to be an American, then you're going to decide that, in fact, we're going to share all of these ups and downs together. So in conclusion, I like to say that our tax policy plus spending policy, our fiscal policy together, represents our fiscal soul. It's a way that we think about our larger obligations. It thinks about the opportunities we have to make this a happier and richer country, the double dividend of inclusive growth. In thinking in those terms, we realize that fiscal policy, including tax policy, which funds all of this, is an exercise in applied moral philosophy, not simply abstract economic models. Everybody, until today, has gotten it wrong. Progressives have fixated on the progressivity of the tax system, the wrong question, and conservatives have fixated on the idea that through the denial of luck, there is no meaningful role of government in our lives other than to hire a military. So when you take this broader view, I think you become, as I say, a more inclusive economy and one that we would all be prouder to be part of. So I'll stop.